We humans just hate change. Now, bear with me for a second. I know that sounds like a blanket statement and very generic. But when push comes to shove, all of us are wired to resist forces, positive or negative, that shift us out of our current state. I had a colleague that worked with me on a clinical pastoral internship at Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, which is where we do chaplaincy work with the patients. And to me, this colleague embodied this resistance in his religious structure. David is an Orthodox Jewish rabbi born and raised here in Brooklyn, and I had a lot to learn about what his world was about, from our totally different religious orientations to even cultural differences. We loved arguing in a safe and supportive way, talking through some very difficult things from our very vastly different frames of reference. And in spite of this dynamic, or I think maybe because of it, we became really good friends. He said to me once, see, the difference between us is that your religion is always looking forward, 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 and we are always looking backward to tell us how to live. While this was a rather stark way to identify the differences in our worldview, it did say a lot about where he was coming from, religiously and socially. Change, from his Orthodox standpoint, was something to be viewed with suspicion, something to be handled very carefully and accepted only within a certain framework. I used to demand of him why he paid literal obeisance to some of the 612 laws in the Torah, such as wearing garments made of all one fabric, but wouldn't dream of obeying others, such as putting his disobedient son to death. Sometimes I would kid him that if he was really Orthodox, he'd better put down his cell phone and never use electricity or running water again. I let him have it sometimes. What about people who are gay, I'd say, or trans? What about women who want to become rabbis? And without revealing any overt prejudice, he would just simply respond, it's not a thing for us. We just have a certain way of being, and that's how we are. Sometimes he would call me out for being just as stuck in my chaotic liberalism from his vantage point as he was in his rigid conservatism from my vantage point. Over the course of getting to know David, though, what ended up surprising me was that he changed a lot the more time we spent together. We were usually on the floors the same days and the same hours, and we would share our experiences with different patients. He would usually avoid going to see the Christian patients, and after I had a couple of somewhat negative experiences with Israeli Orthodox men, I started avoiding going to the Orthodox Jewish patients. But when it was just the two of us at work, we inevitably started supporting each other and finding ways to work together. We would talk theology in the office on breaks, recount patient visits that had been particularly intense, and help each other understand the religious and cultural needs of patients from our very different faiths. I found myself trying to really get underneath and understand what his attachment was to Torah, all of the laws, and why he refused to stay in worship when I would sing a prayer at our multi-faith service, because there are rules in the Talmud that told him that he wasn't supposed to listen to women sing. We had a few very heated discussions around this point, as you might imagine, since I sing constantly in worship. He would marvel, though, at the various explanations that I would give him about how Catholics might think a little bit differently or pray a little bit differently than, say, like a Protestant patient or an evangelical patient. He would even say, you really know all of these traditions. Thank God I have you to ask. But, which is nice, but one of our most personal points of difference was around the reality of human suffering. The kind of suffering that has no redemption, no sense at all, that comes at us full force and is deeply and impossibly unfair. David's response, no matter what it was, systemic injustices, murder, natural disaster, was always, God is in control. When I pressed him on this, with my own process theology worldview that God's goodness also includes vulnerability, that maybe God doesn't cause or will human suffering. He would say, well, if God isn't causing it directly, then it happens because he allows it to happen. If you know me, you know I wasn't going to be sold on this, but neither was he going to be sold on my ridiculous belief that God suffers with us and maybe can just be as vulnerable as we can be. And then one day I was sent with a senior chaplain, Sister Elaine, a 90-year-old nun who had seen everything, to bear witness to a family whose cancer-free, recovering 9-year-old son had just died on the operating table in a horrific and sudden turn of events. I don't know how long we were there, but being with his parents on the floor was one of the most devastating things I had ever seen. Grief truly knows no bounds. And if nothing else, it pushes us completely and utterly out of our ability to make sense of what we thought we knew to be true. And when we returned to the office to debrief for the pastoral care team, I was in tears. David was there, listening, very silent, very sad. And in that moment, I turned to him and I said, I know you feel differently, and I don't ask you to believe any differently. But do you understand why I do not believe that God allows certain things to happen? That God didn't want this boy to die. Do you understand this? And he looked me right in the eye and he said, yes. Yes, I understand you. Our reading for this morning from the Gospel of Mark, this strange and mystical narrative that Christians call the Transfiguration story, shows up in multiple Gospel accounts. It's wonderful in its sense of mystery and its transcendence of the ordinariness of people's lives, and it's also really weird. I've read it over and over. I've read commentaries from other preachers and teachers on the significance of the story. They focus on the figures of Moses and Elijah being there, appearing with Jesus. What does that mean? Or they focus on the voice of God commanding, listen to him, as Moses and Elijah sort of disappear. Listen to Jesus, my son, as proof of his messianic nature and his being the one that they were all sort of waiting for. But no one really pointed out what I couldn't ignore here, what Anne Lamott drives home when she says, I want to change, but it hurts. That this transformation that Peter, James, and John witness forces them into a new way of seeing their beloved teacher, and therefore a new way of being in the world. I want to change, but it hurts. A new way of relating, a shift that means they can never go back to what was before. And as the writer tells us in Mark, they were phobeo in Greek. They were terrified, struck with fear. Waking up is miserable and transformation is terrifying. The transfiguration of Jesus with these superstars of Jewish prophecy, Elijah and Moses, left the disciples terrified, so much so that Peter says, can't we just stay here? Can't we just stay in this moment of transcendence, basking in this chabad, this radiance of God? We'll just make three places for everybody. Just Jesus and Elijah and Moses. We're just going to be really happy right here. We're never going to leave this place because it's so terrifying what's happening. I don't know what to make of it. Because they didn't know how they were going to deal with the world after this experience of shift. Then Elijah and Moses disappear. Jesus is left. A voice shouts, listen to him! Out of the clouds, a whirlwind cameo appearance by God herself. This would be a bit much for me to handle. If it didn't freak out James and John and Peter, I really don't know what would. But life goes on. They couldn't stay on the mountaintop. They couldn't stay in that moment. they had to return to the work that had to be done on earth. They had to return to life, but no longer as they knew it. They wanted to change. They chose to follow this crazy rabbi, Yeshua, but the boundaries were breaking so fast around them. They found themselves resisting the internal change that they knew they were called into. The transfiguration of Jesus, I don't think it's so much actually about the transfiguration of Jesus. It's about the metamorphosis that happens for the disciples. A wildly difficult, totally imperfect, absolutely uncomfortable shift in their way of seeing Jesus, seeing themselves, and ultimately seeing the world that shook them to their core. And as Anne Lamott also recounts, this emergence is probably not going to go well. But that doesn't mean that it isn't supposed to happen. Theologian Caroline Lewis, regarding this idea of transfiguration, puts it this way. We think we welcome change, but when it actually happens, we adopt stances of resistance and rejection. Or we convince ourselves that the change can wait, that the time is not right, that the problems that will ensue are not worth the result of living into who we really are. The problems that ensue are not worth the result of living into who we really are. Why wouldn't we look to remain comfortable, even if it means that we are missing out through these problems, through that discomfort, through shame and hurt and sorrow, of getting to the other side of it and seeing the world with epiphany eyes, learning that the fight was worth it when we gain a different, deeper, more real understanding of the world around us. When we look at each other and we see each other for who we really are, for real, for real. That day at the hospital after that little boy died, after I looked at Rabbi David with tears in my eyes and asked him to try and grasp where I was coming from, was a pivotal event. But not in the way that you might think. What I began to see later on, looking back on all our experiences together, the joking and the very real fights that we had, was that he was changing. He was transforming, evolving, despite his desire to stay the same, despite his boundaries that were so important to him and his community, while maintaining his values and his integrity and his identity. I saw a shift in how we related to me and to our colleagues. I was the one determined to stay the same. I was the one determined to break his boundaries, to loosen him up, to see that there are many ways of being and living and loving in the world. But I wasn't really ready to let myself be shifted out of my own worldview in the process. Truthfully, shamefully, I unconsciously just wanted him to become a little bit more like me. If it had been him witnessing the grief of that poor family and asking me, do you understand why I believe that God has a plan in this grief? That there is a reason for this terrible loss, that God allows horribly unfair things to happen to people. I don't think I could have responded, yes, I understand you, David. Because I wasn't ready to entertain that how I saw the world in very important moments like this wasn't the only way to make sense of hurt and chaos and suffering. That my so-called enlightened, progressive, radical self wasn't quite so radical as I desired to be. I resisted the shift that God was calling me into. And only later did I begin to realize that my work was actually just beginning. And it's still evolving now. Even in seminary, even at Middle Collegiate Church, where I come from, that is so diverse and does so much interrelated justice work, surrounded by like-minded radical progressive theologians, organizers, activists of all kind, boy, do we ever step on each other's toes. We hurt each other. Our work around immigration justice, anti-racism, LGBTQ rights, fighting for our suffering creation, all of this got us into some really heated places because the work is personal and it's hard and the solutions are never clear-cut. Because the queer Black woman's experience of being profiled in Bergdorf Goodman is very different than the white trans man's experience of going off hormones to get pregnant and being ridiculed, being called a freak. Because the straight white middle-class men and women like me were being asked to take a seat and listen when we jumped into conversations about race and racism in America. But also, at the same time, we were being asked to take the hands of our colleagues and risk transformations. Take their hands and risk being wrong. Risk it so we could be at a deeper level of understanding of the work that we very desperately and very, very truthfully wanted to be a part of, so that we could really live into God's most expansive expectations of us. I am still learning to do this. I think we're all still learning to do this, and I'm still working on taking those shards of progress that Lamott speaks of, where they come, in faith that they are gradually teaching me to get a little clearer, to loosen my grasp on my own coveted worldview, not with the aim of diluting my values or diluting my sense of who I am, but with the aim of creating more expanse in my soul, a transfiguration of what I have been that will help me to love more authentically, madly, truly, deeply love. This is the transfiguration of Peter. This is the transfiguration of John. This is the transfiguration of James. And in this scary, weird, crazy, rotten, amazing, cathartic shift, let us dive in too. Let us risk transfiguration, because if we don't, we risk the possibility of keeping out the Chabad, the radiance of God that comes with deeper understanding, broader awareness, those epiphany kind of eyes. Let's risk it for each other and for ourselves, because the beloved community is worth it. We are all infinitely worth it. Amen.